So how are you all this morning? It's not as nice as yesterday, but it's still relatively warm.
Yes. It's looking good right now. I hope it doesn't rain soon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you might be disappointed. Did you see that message, Caitlin, that's just come through from John? He's lost.
Link.
People a couple more minutes to arrive before we get started. Hi, John.
Hello, I'm sorry I'm late. I've just come from...
No, not at all. We've lost our other presenter. He's lost in a Zoom void.
It's
I
like
wonder if everyone else is lost too, because we had more on our RSVP list as well.
maybe they're on the way.
Yeah. So this is a topic after my own heart. I was telling John yesterday, the impetus for this was a conference. You'll all laugh at this story. I went to this conference at UNSW a little while ago, and there was a session on SELTs, and it was run, I think, by the visual arts people. And what they were doing was everyone who got SELTs that hurt their feelings was stitching the hurtful words into little bits of fabric to exercise the feelings that they had when they got their SELTs. And it sort of brought home to me how much SELTs can be a negative rather than a positive feedback loop. So having heard that, I thought it would be worth actually just giving people an opportunity just after the SELTs had happened to actually think about what we can take positively from our SELTs as a tool that gives us a sense of what the student experience is, that can provide us with some insights into useful strategies. So that's kind of the aim of the session. And I'm very pleased to welcome John Willison, who's joining us today. John is from the School of Education. Sorry, I'm just finding the button. And he is has been here since, I think you said, John, 2004.
That's right.
And has been very involved in not only his own teaching, but in leadership, really, of teaching across the university. At the moment, he is coordinating the Graduate Certificate in Higher Education for academics from all faculties.
Oh, that's an old one.
Oh, right.
That must be an ancient bio.
Well, tell us what you're really doing then.
The graduate certificate sort of died in 2014.
Well, I'll skate over that quick detail.
Yeah, I'd avoid that one, yes.
He is very interested in research skills development and how to scaffold student learning throughout the program. Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, that's still current.
Excellent. So thank you, John, for joining us. And thanks also to John Williams, who's joining us. I'm hoping, John, you'll share your SELT stories as well. You're on mute, so we can't hear them, so it's probably safer.
I was going to say only the good ones. John and I share one thing, and that was the time that, I can't remember, was it me or you, John, that took the credit card?
It was definitely you, John.
So I tried to I had to go get our new credit cards, and the office gave me the wrong one, gave me the other JW. And I think I tried to get to New Zealand on somebody else's credit card, which was not a good look.
Actually, no, it was much worse. You actually went to Perth and successfully spent money on my credit card.
That's right.
I'm not sure if I've ever got it back, actually.
No, I'm afraid you didn't. But it's too late to discuss that. Those are old, ancient times. We're not going back in history. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'll stay for as long as I can before I have to be booted off to another meeting. But it's a great pleasure to join you. And I wanted to say congratulations on this initiative. It's really important. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. Okay, well, I'm going to start off and kick us off, and I'm just going to share my screen if I can manage that bit of technological happening. Share. But feel free, we are a small group, so feel free to jump in and ask questions or yell out. And I'm going to start with a reveal of some SELTs that I got some years ago. And just, I think my message is don't be crushed by your SELTs. I think that's my first tip. I've got 4 tips for you, and this is my first one. I think SELTs can often be a very dispiriting experience, and we do know that there's it's a complex thing for students to report back to us what their student experience is, and there are a number of factors that will go into that. The literature suggests those factors include the expectations that they have, and also their perceptions of quality informed by both the substantive quality in the course, but also the way it's delivered, the execution, the how. And all of those things get summarised in a very small survey. So we're trying to summarise something that is quite complex, and often their responses can be, I think, you know, a slice of their experience. So I think take them in context. Don't be crushed. Look for what's useful. So I put here, I made word clouds for you because I like making word clouds. This is a SELT from about 8 years ago that I got, which had some positive comments, which I've got in the pink square there, which I made a word cloud out of, and then some negative comments, including that I was so dull. And I put those in a word cloud as well. But once you put them both, the positive and the negative, together in the word cloud, you actually get a better perspective, I think. And that's sort of, I think mentally sometimes we need to make word clouds and say, you know, there is always some positive in all SELTs, I think, and there's some negative, and we often just focus too heavily on the negative and don't see it in a context as well. So I think my lessons that I learned through the SELT process is one, that I need to manage expectations of students. Quite often it's not that you're not doing the right things or doing what you should do, but actually sometimes you don't necessarily communicate as well as you could about what their expectations should be. And so, you know, if your expectation is that you're not going to answer emails on the weekend, that should be something that you tell them, so that they know what they're getting. Obviously, we need to ensure the quality of the substantive content, but I think the third thing is often underrated by academics and something that really makes a real difference, which is making your course user-friendly. So you can see one of my pieces of feedback here was that my volume of my voice trailed off at the end of every sentence. So they couldn't hear me, which was really useful, practical feedback that I was able to fix very quickly. I got a Madonna-like headset to plug into the lecture thing, which gave a better transmission of my voice, and worked very well in terms of getting everyone, you know, so they could hear me. So I learnt the lesson of don't be crushed, try and find, sorry, I'm trying to transition to my next slide, which is not working. Why is that? There we go. Looking for the easy wins. So the microphone thing for me came up, and I was able to find an easy win for that. There are often easy wins small practical steps that you don't realise. I mean, I had no clue that students couldn't hear me properly. And so I was able to correct that, and I've never seen that in a SELT since. So that was very helpful. And I think many of us get those kind of practical things. I can't find something, you know, on my uni when we get our course SELTs, or this is not easy to access, or, you know, your links aren't working. And sometimes students don't tell you during the course of the semester, but they just save up that feedback for the end, which is unfortunate but easy to fix. My third tip is to invest in the feedback loop. And by this, I think there's a couple of things in this space. I think for our students that we're constantly bombarding them with surveys, and we don't always tell them how we use those surveys. We don't usually close the feedback loop effectively with them so they can see how we can use those surveys to improve their experience. There are some people, some colleagues who are really good at doing this, and you can see their results play this out. So people who tell the students at the beginning of the semester what they've done in response to the SELTs from last year at the first lecture, who inform the students when the SELTs are going to happen, what they're looking for in terms of feedback. You know, I've got this new textbook. I'd really appreciate it if you'd tell me about that. He encouraged students to actually do the SELTs, which often does give you a better sample size and irons out some of the tendency for people who either really love you or really hate you to be the total people on your SELT. Try and get some of those people in the middle who are useful. So I think investing in the feedback loop by telling students how you use the SELTs, by giving that feedback to them and encouraging them to do the SELTs, can be a really useful way of letting them know how much you value the SELT feedback, and thereby encouraging them to make it as useful as possible. My fourth tip is really to take a strategic approach. So SELTs are a piece of feedback that amongst many different pieces of feedback about our work. And we are, I think, you know, they have their flaws, and there's certainly plenty of ways we can challenge what the reliance on SELTs as a marker of teaching. Having said that, they are a useful piece of feedback provided we take them in context. And I think there is an opportunity with SELTs to take a strategic approach, and John is going to fill in some of the talk about a particularly strategic approach that he's taken to SELTs in a moment. But to look at it as a project, what is the feedback? I think opening up the conversation about SELTs and talking about the kinds of things with your colleagues that is being said to you, and testing ideas on them on how you can respond to your SELTs in a positive way. So those little practical steps are easy, but often there is some greater challenges in SELT feedback about your course or about your teaching style, and looking at those in a strategic way, and perhaps thinking about, well, what one thing can I do to respond to these SELTs that will lead to a better result for next time. So I'm going to let John perhaps take over and talk in more depth about the strategic approach that he has taken to his SELTs in his course or courses. And then there'll be some time for discussion at the end.
Thanks, Suzanne. I was thinking of your trail-off comment, and I remember when I was at Curtin Uni years ago, I had a lot of students put into their feedback the word grapple. So I was obviously talking about students grappling with, deep learning and blah, 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 and totally overused the word. So that was a big slap to say, okay, I can't use that word all the time. But it's interesting, just practical things like that can be really help smooth the learning environment, so you don't get distracting little things like trail offs or overuse of words, stuff like that. So that's pretty cool. So let me go to slideshow. So I think you might be already overloaded, because Suzanne had 4 tips for how to engage with SELTs and improve SELTs. So I thought I kind of limited to 2, so we didn't overload the session. And obviously what we're really wanting to do is have some really good discussion about Suzanne's 4, my 2 ideas and others. So there's a lot of expertise here already with people engaging with SELTs. So I think when we open up for Q&A, Suzanne will be looking for other people's ideas too. Is that right? Yep, beautiful.
Absolutely.
And I hope everyone's got
and
their
also
tea.
if you have particular problems to share as well.
Yeah,
and you've got your tea. I haven't got my tea.
Yeah, because it is the morning. I like the L and T, so I'm disappointed if people don't have their tea. This is ginger and lemon, in case you're wondering. So I'm going to talk about the course EDUC 3001, Reflective Practice, because it's had an interesting evolution. It's a medium-ish size course, typically about 100 enroll, although it actually has runs in both semesters. So you typically have a heavier semester and a lighter semester, and it does move around a bit. But I inherited the course in 2019, and it's a course that's part of our teacher accreditation. And I know in your, this faculty, you've got a lot of accreditation issues. You've got AACSB coming up for the business school, and law has their own accreditation versions. So this one was a course that was kind of bundled together to satisfy a lot of teacher registration board requirements for our program. And in fact, the program is what is the old program, and this is the last year that it'll be actually taught, because the new program has got done some renewal. But when I inherited the course, the 2018 SELT, the year before I started on it, was showed up some fairly substantial issues. There was like below the threshold broad agreement. So there's plenty of students who are not really satisfied with the overall quality of the course, and other issues as well, which I'll show you just 1 or 2. But and when I inherited the course, I only had a small amount of time to actually make any changes. In fact, that 2019, I was putting in a discovery grant and ended up soaking up a lot of my time that I would have been better off preparing for this course. But so I've made a few small tweaks, you could say. And it was interesting. One of the big things I was trying to do is improve coherence. And so in 2019, there was, with about 104 students, so we had about roughly 40% response rate, with students showing a substantial shift in the overall quality of the course. And then when I had a bit more time, then 2020, like last semester, it was a slightly smaller cohort, so it was about 76 students. But the broad agreement showed some positive responses to changes to try to make the whole thing a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is run through 2 ideas that that led to that improvement. And I think because the fundamental thing, and we're talking about with Suzanne yesterday, is the E in SELT stands for experience. So it's always been, since 2003, I think, student experience of learning and teaching. And so the whole idea from this was supposed to be that it helps improve the learning experience we provide for students. Now, of course, it's been subsumed into a whole quality assurance and PDR, and people feel quite dominated by SELT and SELT results. So both the qualitative and quantitative, quantitative Likert scale responses, as well as the qualitative feedback. And I think to be able to have an approach where you're really looking to improve the student's experience, again, based on the feedback on that experience, can give you a very positive mindset and really take a dynamic, and as Suzanne's tip 4, I think it was, take a strategic approach. And Suzanne, what was your tip 3? Could you, because I remember I wanted to mention that too.
Sorry, invest in the feedback loop. So
Yeah.
you
So,
tell students about it.
Thank you. So that strategic approach and investing in the feedback loop. So I'll look at the strategic approach first, actually, in point 1, and then investing in the feedback loop will be my second and final point. So the first idea is instead of waiting to the end to run SELT, I, back in 2019, ran a mid-course SELT, like literally in week 6, being semester 1, the first time it ran, it was just before the mid-semester break. So that was convenient because it meant I had a chance to look at the SELT responses and decide what I could respond to, and then tell the students about my response, so what changes I was making. And in fact, in 2019, the midway feedback was almost identical to the 2018 one, before I ran the course. So it looked like nothing had shifted. So it was running pretty much on par, and it had been like that in 2017 as well. So whatever little things I'd done, the students weren't particularly any more satisfied. In fact, it's the same. But because I was able to articulate to the students in the anonymous SELT that I ran on SurveyMonkey, because I was able to actually get their feedback and tell them about some of the things I was going to change, then that resulted in that much higher broad agreement that we saw before, which was the 85% in 2019. So ultimately, I think students really respond to something that's for them. So one of the problems with the feedback that students give themselves is it's always for someone else. So I think if it can be for them. Now, it turns out that this strategy is one that you could do fairly easy to implement the actual survey. I just use SurveyMonkey because we had the account. I now use Qualtrics because of School of Education, and I think your faculty has moved over to Qualtrics too, maybe. But it means that you're harvesting that data pretty efficiently. And you'll see that I had 40% response, which is not world shattering, but nor is it as bad as it can often get with SELTs down to 20%, 15%. I was always been hoping for more, but I tend to get about, this time I got 50%. I just ran one last week. I got 50% of the students responded. So it's reasonable. But I think the big factor is, as Susan said, closing that feedback loop. It's not the fact that I kind of get the feedback from them. That's not really full feedback, but engage in presentation. So I just did a recording of my response and put that up on my uni about half an hour ago to say, this is your feedback. And I showed them all the comments and some of the Likert scale responses. And they know that there's some things that I'll change and some things that I won't change. So my response, I first of all talk about all the good things, because there's in every course, there's always plenty of good things. And Suzanne's word cloud is good because it sort of reminded her and reminds us that you've got to look at the positives and to word cloud it, there's all of these great features. So it's not just trailing off, but there's caring and, you know, warm and humor and things like that. So I do point out to students that this is working well. Like, so this semester, the tutorials have been working really well. People like the structure of that. And I point out that that won't change because they've given feedback. And it's, so remember that universities, the language, especially now more than ever, is about change and innovation. But actually, the most important thing about change is working out what to change and what not to. And if you change things that are working well, that's negative. So we should add the second C into the change conversation, which is, first of all, work out what's the baby before you chuck out the bathwater. So consolidation is actually super important for SELTs. And so that doubly amplifies Susan's comments about the positives. And students like hearing that and thinking, oh, wow, almost everyone really loved this. There was one person who didn't like it, you know, and you have to deal with that. But then the quick changes. Someone said they'd like to have more dynamic, or more diverse interaction with people in the class in the face-to-face session we're running in the tutorial this afternoon. So I've already told them in the audio feedback, well, we can do that. We can actually mix up the groups. We've kind of had consistent groups in the face-to-face tutes. And of course, in the Zoom tute, we've had the automatic breakout group allocation. So that has been mixed up. So I've already told them that there will be quick changes like that. And they know that there's things that will affect them and in real time. Now there's things that some people don't like, but I think it's important to say, I'm not changing this. So it's important, sometimes it's because only one or two people say that, and you think the majority wouldn't like this. So for example, from the feedback I got last week, someone said, I should tell them more about what makes a good teacher instead of eliciting things out of discussion and then making commentary. But other people said there should be more discussion in the tutorials. So, so I'm not going to make a change and be more didactic because one person said that. If a lot of them said it, you know, I'd certainly strongly consider it. And of course, then there's the things we do normally for SELT, and that Suzanne was talking about, where you've got feedback from a previous cohort, what's going to go into the future. So sometimes there's things that I just can't change now, and in the next 6 weeks, literally. And I tell them, well, this is something that I might change for another cohort. But so the first three things are for them, you know, the students I've got currently enrolled this semester. So I think that gives them a sense of closing the feedback loop and makes for a very dynamic feedback conversation where their voice is valued, but it doesn't dominate the whole response. Now, I'm going to move into kind of the second idea, and it connects to, again, closing the feedback loop, but from the other angle. This is feedback I give students. Now, we know that across the university and across Australia, students find that feedback is a little bit on the unsatisfactory side. It's usually the lowest SELT score item. So this one, this is the 2018, same course again, reflective practice. It was getting that pretty, you know, below, low 72% with satisfaction, but plenty of dissatisfaction with useful and timely feedback. And 2019, that went to 100% satisfaction with there was 14 who responded to that. And in 2020, when it was also at 100%. So the strategy I used is the one that Suzanne labeled as strategic. Even more, the first one I suppose is strategic, but this one requires either some strategic forward planning, or in my case, I kind of got lucky. So I'll show you. So 2018, there was one assignment that was due relatively early in semester, but it was worth 60%. And so it was a big monster really early on, which I think was a little bit odd. And it was actually 2 critical incident reports, both worth 1,000 words. And I looked at this even before I started and thought there's something that I could do some quick changes that don't get away from the key parameters that are required both in teacher registration and by the university, but I can do some nice little shifts. So what I did was I broke it into 2 parts, 2A and 2B. And 2A focused on, the substance was on learning, critical learning incidents. And I made it the shorter one. It was worth 800 words. And it was worth 1/3 of the weighting, 20%. And 2B focused on the substance of to do with risk, critical risk incident. So they're both about critical incidents that had 2 different, slightly different content focuses. And the second one was 1,200 words and was due about 5 weeks later and was worth 40%. So it meant that 2A, they had a chance to get feedback on 2A and respond to that feedback. That was a requirement for 2B. And then the weighting meant that it was actually really worth doing it. And so it wasn't so high stakes as that one big 60% monster. So the second tip was, if this is possible, it's worth redesigning assessment so that students respond to your feedback and get marked for their response. Because we've already said that Likert scale always tends to be low for feedback. Students, and I think, let me say simply, the core reason is what Suzanne said, closing the feedback loop. If students get information on marking rubrics, we call that feedback, but it's not closing the feedback loop because they're not responding to it. So when they're required to respond to it, that makes all the difference in the world. And this one, I actually used, because they're both critical incident reports, that report genre, I used almost identical marking criteria for both rubrics. So, so the first time, students rarely understand rubrics. And in fact, I had one feedback just last week on that very thing. They kind of wanted more detail, but you know, a lot of people glaze over when they see rubrics. The only person who understands a rubric is the author or authors. Anyone else, it takes a hard journey, whether it's tutors or students. They need conversations, dynamic conversations to bring them alive. And things like students applying them to mark other students' work or stuff like that. But in this case, I used the rubrics, gave them ticks, but also gave them comments. In fact, I use audio feedback because I don't want to type too much. And give them specific reasons why they're ticked at a distinction band or unsatisfactory. And because both 2A and 2B had the same rubrics, that means that when they're starting to engage with 2B, they understand that rubric a lot more, but partly because it's the same one, but partly because they've got to listen to and look at the feedback I gave them on 2A and respond to it. So the big difference between 2A and 2B is this additional criteria. Uses feedback from 2A report to improve 2B and explains response in Appendix 2. Now, that phrasing is very important because you don't want to spend time like looking at 2 reports and thinking how much better is this one and what do they do? You don't want that stuff. You don't want to even like them to tell you somewhere. So I've got a very specific to say improve, locate the response in Appendix 2. So there's usually 1 or 2 paragraphs. I love marking them. They're easy to mark. There's levels of success in how effective they are at responding. And this is what closes the feedback loop. This is what makes it into a conversation. And this helps them to much more deeply understand the marking criteria for 2B. And so I'm seeing significant improvements from 2A to 2B, partly because of this. They're able to articulate how they've responded to my feedback in improving 2B. So this is actually amazingly small addition of work for two reasons. One is it's only a paragraph to mark and I know exactly where to find it. But more importantly for you is I spend all the marking time on 2A giving comments, so they got something to respond to. And in 2B, I literally have in the assignment, I will not give you anything more than tick box on the rubrics unless you ask for it. And you'll ask for it because you're going to use it. So I actually, and almost very few students ask for it. And if they do ask for it, I'm happy to give it to them because I'm kind of trusting that they'll kind of, you know, do something with it for future work. But it's almost like if I think of the 100% success for feedback in the last 2 years, I think students get this sense of a conversation that feedback should really be, and that they're dynamically engaging with this in a way that is a bit different to them. So this is strategic and something to consider into the future, but it's not an increase in workload. As I was explaining to Suzanne, it's shifting the workload earlier in semester. So I still 2,000 words to mark, still want to give feedback, but I'm giving the concerted effort with rubric and audio in 2A, and then rubric only in 2B. And because the improvement in students' work, their capacity to be critical thinking around these critical incidents, I find it really satisfying, and I think that the students have responded in like time. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand back to Suzanne, stop sharing, and I'll kick back over to you, Suzanne, for your chairing of the Q&A.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks for sharing those two strategies. So we've kind of had a run through some quick tips and then some really practical steps that I think John has taken that have had quite significant results in his teaching. But I kind of wanted to open it up to anyone and to discuss, I guess, any of those things that we've talked about, but also what your experience is and whether there is something that you would like to road test with us as, in relation to your SELT. Because I think one of the things we can do as staff is just open up the conversation, because we're all getting these things and sometimes we don't know what to do with them really. So I'd like it to open it up to everybody to perhaps jump off mute and offer, you know, ask any questions or offer any insights that you have. Also, if you have any tips of things that have worked for you, that would also be helpful, I'm sure. So fire away.
Thanks, Suzanne and John. I'm John Murphy. I'm a learning designer with ECMS as well, and DACE, but I'm also teaching in the School of Business this year, semester 1, in professional practices course with Natalia. So yeah, it's been great to have a bit of a split academic professional role, a bit of a 360 view. So I'm really interested to hear on you know, what you've been doing and your tips on the SELTs. So the 4 points there, Suzanne, and also John, about the feedback. Do you think it's, have you tried asking students to kind of self-evaluate before they submit and to give points for that, to say what they've done well and what's been a challenge and maybe the specific feedback that they need?
Yes. So I only do that after students have had experience with an assessment rubric. Because they're so hard to interpret, I do that for something like 2B, where they've already engaged with the rubric before. And sometimes for this particular course, I've asked them an additional criteria. I did have last year, but not this year, was to get them to self-assess in that very way, with a rubric that's become a lot more familiar, and they've had feedback from you know, the academic. So self feedback is really, really important, but also the timing of when to do that is important. And sometimes there's this really nice paper that's called Unskilled and Unaware, where the strongest students tend to under self-assess their capacities and the weaker students tend to over self-assess. And so there's a danger of getting students to self-assess too soon. And also, like, sometimes people use self-assessment for students to allocate themselves marks. I prefer to mark their self-assessing process. So not just say, well, you know, you're in the same ballpark as me, but look at how they're able to articulate why they tick themselves in a certain area. So I actually literally, if they tick themselves on a rubric, I give them 50% for that particular criteria. But if they're able to articulate why they're at that level, then that push them up into more like towards credit or distinction level. So there, yeah, I love self-assessment. It's really important to manage. Yeah.
Sure. Have you found, I've read some research as well that says that gender can be an influence, that women tend to under self-assess.
Yeah.
They play down their knowledge, whereas men are more likely to overplay their role, same group work.
Yep, that's right. And when you mention group work, obviously when people, a common strategy is students allocate other group members marks for their participation. Again, I personally find quite a few problems with that strategy, and it's I prefer to get students to give feedback to another student, not marks, but feedback on their performance, and then I mark the feedback they give. So they don't change someone else's score, but how effectively they're giving feedback is what affects their score. Sort of things like that. Student allocation of their own marks or someone else's marks is, you know, could be done really well, but it's actually really hard to manage.
Thanks, John. That's great. Suzanne.
I might jump in there, John. I really like the way you've really created the sense of formative assessment through that first and second piece. Do you think? I'm wondering how important, I guess, that self-assessment of the feedback is for that process of formation, because we would often have assessments that we think of as formative, but we would not have that extra piece of assessing the feedback and say getting students to articulate how they've used the feedback in their new response. Do you see that as the critical piece?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I think that, in fact, what I'll do is, while I'm answering that, I'll show you a student example because I got permission. So is that a good idea to see a way a student articulated it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think it's a fundamental difference because the student, in effect, it sounds a bit negative to say it like this, but because you're watching the students, you're marking, you're looking for evidence of response, then students will respond. If there is no sense that you will necessarily be kind of looking for a response, then you could say the pressure's off. But we know that people used to complain that no one picks up my assignments, or only like there's 70% of all my assignments left in the paper pile. That was the old complaint. Now the new complaint is, well, you know, it's harder to tell if people in an electronic environment are looking at feedback, but people have an intuitive sense that students are not looking at feedback. And my simple question is, why would they? And the answer to that is give them a reason to. So if they don't have a reason, and if I don't have a reason to look at feedback, then I probably won't look. And the reason we tend to, as academics and teachers, look at feedback is because it's something that's going to somehow or other bite us on the backside. So we've got a kind of vested reason so that we need to give students a good reason to actually bother just looking at it. When I'm talking about much more than looking at it, but plenty of students don't read the feedback is the anecdotal evidence, isn't it? And so then to move to, not only did you read it, but you actually did something with it. So I think fundamentally, it's not just that we're kind of be looking, but it's fundamentally that we're talking about student engagement, but it's thinking about cognitive engagement in learning. There's all this feedback. Why wouldn't, if we've spent all this time, like, there's a lot of money, like it's thousands of dollars, and some of your big courses, I dread to think how much to mark one assignment. And if there's written comments, what's the value add if you put it like that? What's actually, is it worth it? Because often giving feedback isn't necessarily worth it. I think we've got to make that kind of contribution of value, a bit of a value proposition. So I'm going to show you Alexandra Gavrilides' feedback, if I'm just scrolling down through that. Okay, I haven't read this for a while, so I'll share screen. So can you see that okay, Suzanne?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave you just to read this for a second. Now, I'll emphasize one thing. Feedback is as much about consolidation as it is about change for the students as well as us in SELTs. So what Suzanne was saying about the positives and the negatives being so important, it's so important that students know what they did well. And for the strong students, they need to know why this was strong. And because, like for me, from 2A to 2B, they need to use kind of similar strategies, but apply it to a whole new risk context, which is quite a shift. They need to look at a whole different set of literature and stuff. So the structure of the report's the same, but the content makes it such a different thing to engage with. So they need to know from 2A, and I think our students generally need to know what is good. I interviewed a lot of students a year after they've completed courses or a year after they've completed degrees. And I remember one of the earlier students said, yeah, I got a distinction and in other courses, I really hated it because I never knew why. And I was always fearful that I wouldn't be able to maintain that level. And this course gave me the feedback. I knew why I got a distinction. It was so helpful. And I always remember that. But students need to be able to consolidate.
I think that's really interesting, John, because often, you're marking the big stack of assignments or whatever, and you get to the good paper and you just think, oh, this is a relief. I don't have to provide so many comments with this. I've got it right.
Yeah, that's right.
That's obviously the dark side.
Yeah, the good students are being punished.
Yeah. Now,
there's also, for the students who are really struggling, it's also important to consolidate, because if they feel like that it's all garbage, then that's very dispiriting. So I'm always hunting around for the best sentence or the best articulation or the best part and saying, yeah, it was, your title was poor. It didn't capture, the essence of the report. It didn't encapsulate it. The introduction was, but your analysis did this, and here's a sentence, and this is the way you cited the literature. And this one sentence is your best part, and use that as an example. And so that consolidation. So I suppose just getting students to respond to feedback, but if it's all negative, they may not find it useful. there's almost always positives. So you might have noticed in the criteria, I find it very important. I'll go back to the PowerPoint slide. Yeah, it's there. I actually have a 0, no evidence. And if I mark the title, and a student gives me critical incident report, they get a 0 because there's no evidence of them doing it. That's my title. So I'm very clear on telling them you have to write a title that epitomizes your report. It has to be captivating, engaging for an early career teacher. So they've got a specific audience. But a lot of students in the first time get highly unsatisfactory for a whole variety of reasons, which I tell them. Occasionally, students get the distinctive. Occasionally, someone gets up here too. But it's important that if they give no title, or there's a big difference between no title or my title, 0, and their own poor title, because when they got a poor title, I can give them some really constructive feedback on why it was unsatisfactory. So it's very important to distinguish between 0 evidence and something that is not good enough. So students at least put in an effort. That's a big difference. So all those sort of things are very important, I think, to closing the feedback loop in ways that does have that critique and pointing out the weaknesses. But the consolidation, I think, is absolutely vital for us and for students to know, well, I keep this baby. This is the bathwater that I'm throwing out.
Other questions or comments?
I'll say something here. Just I've got to leave shortly, but been very useful. Thank you very much. In that, one thing that I fault on is I give too much feedback, and so that takes an inordinate amount of time. So I, for the last couple of years, have been looking for ways in which to shrink that time, but still give the students that critical information that they need. And some of what I've heard today, so thanks to both of you, has been really useful in how to reconstruct what I do. What I have found useful goes back to John's formative assessment. Give them some really in-depth assessment there, and then thereafter I can hold Zoom meetings for those that want the feedback, and then we can drill down into the elements that I felt weren't constructed properly in the assignment. And I found that so much better because, as John also said, you can create a sheet of feedback for a student and it's completely ignored. So you just feel, well, that was such a waste of my time. Whereas you put it all together in a meeting, either face-to-face or on Zoom, and those that want to be there are there. They're the ones who want the feedback to improve the next time. So I'm just constantly looking for ways in which to improve the process so the student gets everything that they're looking for. Those that don't always want to hear it get something, and those that really are seeking to improve get what they need, but it also is manageable from the academics point of view.
Yeah, that sounds good, Wendy. Yeah.
Well, today was very useful. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Yeah, I think that, it's interesting that our session has ended up talking quite a lot about assessment, which is probably a reflection of how important it is in a student experience, really. We all know that if we say this is in the exam, they pay attention. If we say that it's not in the exam, they don't pay attention.
Well, what I've had more recently is students asking for exemplars. And I don't really like to give an exemplar, only because you then get 150 copies of that. Yeah. And you don't see their broader thinking or how some drill down into certain elements. So what's the thinking on providing exemplars? At an undergraduate level, I'm asked for that more than at a postgrad.
Yeah, I tend to avoid it as well. I have done it in some situations in the past and found it frustrating to see it reappearing in subsequent iterations of the course in various forms. So I think it does tend, I found it comes back to bite you. What I did in one of my courses was, with the students' permission, in a class exercise, this was in the days when you could actually have your students in the same room as you, I got some assignments of the same category that I was about to launch with my students. From the past year, I got permission from the students from a previous year to use their assignment answers. And I handed those around in class and got the students to mark them and say what they liked about them, and have a discussion about actually what was good and what wasn't so good about those papers.
I like that. I like that.
I got them to hand them all back, so I didn't see them again. But it actually was a way of trying to, these were first year students, and try and introduce them to the fact that, these are the kind of things we're looking for in this assignment before it happens. So I tried that for a few years. Thank you. We should wind up too.
I better run off, but thanks everyone.
Thank you very much, John, for doing that for us. It was really interesting, and I'm sure everyone has appreciated your time and expertise.
Great, and I've almost finished my ginger tea, so I was the only one holding up the fort.
I'll come on here.
Oh, good.
Almond latte
No one
keeps disappearing.
Good. Well, keep up the LMT. That's great. Bye-bye.
Right. Thanks, John. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks.
Everybody. Thank you.
I
Bye
look
for now.
forward to seeing you at the next one.
For sure. Love to.
All right. Take
See you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.